Washington, D.C., November 15th, 1975. A woman who had spent 30 years striking through other people's words sat down to write her own. But when her pen touched the paper, she understood something terrible. She remembered absolutely everything. Every crossed-out word, every revised sentence, every author whose fate she had altered with a stroke of her blue pencil. And the most horrifying part? She remembered what happened to them afterward. To all of them. Every single one. Vera Ashford sat at the writing desk in her apartment on Q Street. She was 57 years old, gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses with thin wire frames perched on her nose, a worn cardigan draped over her shoulders against the draft that seeped through the old window frames. Before her lay a stack of clean typing paper, a cup of cold coffee gone bitter, and a fountain pen she had owned since college. 3 days ago, 2 young people had come from Beacon Press, a man and a woman in bell-bottoms and turtlenecks, the kind they now called activists. The woman wore her hair long and unstyled, no makeup. The man had a beard and wire-rimmed glasses. They spoke rapidly, interrupting each other, gesturing with enthusiasm that seemed to fill the small apartment. Quote 0, quote 1, she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Quote 2. She said nothing. Watched their burning eyes, their youthful conviction, their absolute certainty that truth would somehow matter, that revealing secrets would change something. Quote 3, she finally said. Quote 4. They left, trailing the scent of cheap cigarettes and optimism. She remained alone, in the silence, in which echoed 30 years. Vera was born in 1918 in Philadelphia. Father, Morton Ashford, an accountant for Bethlehem Steel. Mother, Eleanor, a piano teacher who gave lessons in their parlor. They survived the Depression, though it aged them both. Her father would come home with his shoulders stooped, carrying the weight of layoffs he had to calculate, pensions he had to cancel. Her mother's students dropped away one by one as families could no longer afford luxuries like music lessons. Vera remembered the silence of those years. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy, suffocating silence of worry. The silence of her mother's unsold piano sitting in the corner. The silence of her father reading the unemployment numbers in the evening paper. Her father died in 1936 from a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. He was 52. They found him slumped over his desk at the steel company office, pen still in hand, halfway through a column of figures. Her mother lasted until 1940, though Vera suspected she had given up living years earlier. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but Vera knew it was the silence that killed her. The silence of an empty house, a silent piano, a life that had lost its music. Vera was left alone at 22 with a college diploma, $47, and a reference letter for graduate school that she couldn't afford to use. She had enrolled at Bryn Mawr College in 1938 on a scholarship, studied English literature with fierce hunger, as if trying to compensate for everything the Depression had stolen from her family. She read Whitman, Dickinson, Hawthorne, Melville. She wrote papers on symbolism and metaphor and the architecture of meaning. She graduated summa cum laude in 1942, just as America was fully at war. They recommended her for doctoral studies at Yale, but there was no money for that. No time for that. The country needed everyone. In December 1942, a recruiter from the War Department came to campus. He was looking for women with excellent English skills, attention to detail, discretion. The Office of War Information needed editors, people who could review materials before publication, people who could be trusted. Vera applied, passed the interview, passed the background check, started work on January 8, 1943. She was 24 years old. First day of work, an office on the 3rd floor of a nondescript building on Pennsylvania Avenue. Gray walls that had once been white, tall windows that looked out onto the street where people hurried past, wrapped in winter coats, heads down against the wind. The smell of tobacco and old paper and the peculiar mustiness of government buildings. Her supervisor, Wallace Drummond, was a man in his 50s with a face like carved granite and eyes like a hawk. He had served in the First War, she learned later, had seen things that made him believe absolutely in control, in order, in the necessity of managing information. He sat her down in his office that first morning. Outside, snow was beginning to fall. "Miss Ashford," he said, "do you understand what we do here?" "I review materials for publication, to ensure they're appropriate." That's the sanitized version. Let me be direct. You're a sanitary barrier between the writer and the public. Your job is to remove anything that could cause harm. Defeatist sentiments, criticism of the war effort, information that could aid the enemy, anything that undermines morale, anything that makes people question whether we can win this war. Because if people start questioning, Miss Ashford, we might not win. And if we don't win, everything else is irrelevant. Clear? Clear. You have excellent education. You know literature. You can probably recite Wordsworth and analyze Melville's Whale until the cows come home. But that doesn't matter here. What matters is instinct, political instinct. You must sense danger, like a hunting dog senses game. You must smell it on the page before it reaches the reader. He handed her a manuscript, a novel by an aspiring writer about life in a munitions factory. Read it tonight. Cross out anything unnecessary. On your desk, you'll always find a blue pencil. Not red. We're not Soviets. Blue. The color of reason, of calm authority. It's your tool, your weapon. Learn to use it without hesitation. Vera took the manuscript home to her rented room in a boarding house on M Street. A small room, barely large enough for a bed, a chair, a hot plate. She shared a bathroom with 3 other women. But it was hers, and it was quiet after 9 o'clock when the other residents settled in for the night. She made tea, sat on her bed with the manuscript spread across her lap, read all night by the yellow light of a single lamp. The author's name was Dalton Kramer, age 28, from Baltimore. This was his first novel. The book was weak in many ways. The plot meandered, the dialogue was stiff, the characters were thinly drawn. But it had something, an honesty, a rawness. The protagonist, Frank, worked the night shift at a munitions plant. He was tired all the time. He drank to stay awake, then drank to sleep. He fought with his wife, Martha, about the long hours, about the danger, about the safety regulations being ignored to meet production quotas. He worried constantly that one mistake would kill him or his co-workers. In the final third of the book, there was an explosion. Frank had seen it coming, had reported the faulty equipment, the shortcuts, the pressure from management. No one listened. 17 men died, including Frank. The book ended with Martha reading Frank's last letter, in which he wrote, __quote_12__. Vera sat with the manuscript in her lap as dawn began to break outside her window. She understood what she had to do. She picked up the blue pencil that Drummond had given her, drew the first line through a paragraph where Frank complained about exhaustion. Then another through a scene where he argued with his wife. Then another through his observations about the shortcuts and the danger. By the time the sun was fully up, the manuscript was riddled with blue lines. Whole pages crossed out. The explosion gone. Frank's death gone. His final letter gone. She went to work at 8 o'clock and placed the edited manuscript on Drummond's desk. He reviewed it that afternoon while she sat in her small cubicle, hands folded, waiting. At 4 o'clock, he called her into his office. Quote 13. Quote, he said, not looking up from the pages. Quote 14. Quote 15. Quote 16. Quote 17. Quote. The book was published 6 months later, in August 1943. Vera saw it in a bookstore on Connecticut Avenue one Saturday afternoon. She stood in the aisle, holding the slim volume, reading. There was nothing in it that she had crossed out. Frank no longer drank, didn't fight with his wife. His concerns about safety had been transformed into patriotic determination to meet production goals. There was no explosion. At the end, Frank became a shift supervisor and received a commendation from the plant manager for his dedication. She bought the book, took it home, read it cover to cover that night. It wasn't the book Dalton Kramer had written. It was a shell, a hollow version. The bones of his story with all the flesh stripped away. She wondered if he had seen it yet, if he had opened it and recognized nothing. 2 years passed. Vera edited hundreds of manuscripts, novels, short stories, poetry, journalism, government pamphlets, educational materials. Everything that would be published during wartime crossed her desk or the desks of her colleagues. She became efficient. Ruthless, some whispered. She could identify problematic passages within minutes. Her blue pencil moved swiftly, confidently. She never second-guessed herself. Drummond promoted her in 1944. She got a small raise and a slightly larger cubicle. She was 26 years old and had helped reshape dozens of books. In April 1945, she saw a small item in the newspaper. Dalton Kramer, author, had died. The obituary was brief. No details about the cause of death. She learned the truth a week later from a colleague who had a contact in Baltimore. Kramer had taken his own life in his boarding house room, left a note that said only, ___, quote, _18__. Vera read this information standing in the office hallway. She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not guilt exactly, but a recognition, a knowledge that she had done something irreversible. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed and saw words floating in the darkness, the words she had crossed out from Kramer's manuscript. They glowed faintly blue, as if lit from within. She closed her eyes. The words didn't disappear. They were still there, behind her eyelids, in that space between waking and dreaming. She opened her eyes, stared at the ceiling until dawn. That was when she began to understand that something was wrong with her memory. The war ended in August 1945. Vera watched the celebrations from her office window. People flooded the streets, laughing, crying, embracing strangers. The silence of war, the silence of censorship, of withheld information, of careful language, was breaking apart. But the Office of War Information didn't close. It transformed, became absorbed into other agencies. The mission changed from wartime censorship to peacetime information management. Cultural diplomacy, they called it. Managing America's image abroad. Ensuring that what the world saw of American culture was appropriate, constructive, aligned with national interests. Vera stayed. Where else would she go? This was her skill now. This was what she knew how to do. By 1948, she had transitioned to the State Department's Cultural Affairs Division. The work was similar but broader. Books that would be translated and distributed in Europe. Publications meant to showcase American democracy, American freedom, American prosperity. And her job was still the same. Remove anything that could be misunderstood. Anything that didn't present America in the proper light. She edited books about American history, crossed out references to slavery that were too graphic, softened descriptions of labor conflicts, removed criticism of American foreign policy. She edited contemporary novels, removed profanity, sexual content, anything that might suggest American society was less than wholesome. She edited poetry, crossed out anything too dark, too despairing, too questioning. The blue pencil became an extension of her hand. The second book she remembered in perfect detail came to her in spring 1943, a poetry collection. Author: Lenore Calloway, a high school English teacher from a small town in Ohio, 39 years old, never published. The cover letter was touchingly humble. "I've been writing these poems for 20 years," she wrote in careful script. "I never thought anyone would want to read them, but a friend encouraged me to submit them. I hope they might bring some small comfort to readers during these difficult times." Vera read the poems on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. 42 poems total. They were about nature, love, silence, time. On the surface, They seemed gentle, pastoral even. But Vera, already trained to read between lines, saw the subtext immediately. The silence in these poems wasn't peace. It was absence, emptiness, void. The nature didn't bloom with hope. It withered, rotted, returned to earth. The love didn't warm or comfort. It burned, maimed, left only ashes and regret. One poem in particular stopped her. Quote 21 ___. Vera read it 3 times, felt something twist in her chest. This was dangerous. Not because it was explicitly political, but because it articulated something that people weren't supposed to feel during wartime. Doubt, despair, the crushing weight of things left unsaid. She crossed out 17 poems out of 42, left only those where the imagery could be read optimistically, where silence could be interpreted as peaceful contemplation rather than suppression, where nature's cycles could be seen as renewal rather than decay. The collection was accepted for publication. Print run, 2,000 copies. A small press in New York. Publication date, September 1943. Lenore Calloway came to Washington in October for a reading at a bookstore near DuPont Circle. Vera learned about it from the publisher's newsletter that circulated through the office. She went. She didn't know why. Professional curiosity, perhaps. Or something else she couldn't name. The reading was on a Thursday evening. 15 people attended. Mostly women, mostly middle-aged. Lenore Calloway stood at a small podium, a slight woman in a threadbare coat that had been mended at the elbows. She clutched a bouquet of cheap carnations someone had given her. Her hands trembled as she opened her book. She read 3 poems. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. After each poem, the small audience applauded politely. Afterward, she stood by the door, signing the few books that sold. Vera watched from across the room, saw the woman's face, the shy pride, the disbelieving joy. First book at 39. Vera left without speaking to her. A month later, FBI agents came to Lenore Calloway's house in Ohio. Someone had reported her for defeatist activities. Someone had attended one of her private poetry readings, informal gatherings at her house where she read her work to friends. Someone had written down the poems she read, the ones that hadn't been published, the ones Vera had crossed out. Someone had passed them to the Bureau. The investigation took 3 months. Lenore Calloway was never charged with any crime. But she lost her teaching position, was blacklisted from other schools. Her book was quietly pulled from stores. The publisher dropped her contract. Vera learned about it by accident 6 months later. A colleague mentioned it in passing during lunch. Quote 22 ___. Vera said nothing, finished her sandwich, went back to her desk. That night, she dreamed for the first time of the crossed-out words. In the dream, she was in a dark room. The walls were covered with pages, thousands of pages, and on each page words glowed blue in the darkness, all the words she had crossed out. They hung in the air like constellations, and she heard a voice, a woman's voice, speaking the poem she had crossed out. Listen to the silence, not the absence of sound, the presence of all that cannot be said. Vera woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the room dark, silent. But the words were still there, in her mind, glowing blue. She got up, made tea, sat by the window until dawn. The words didn't leave. By 1950, Vera was one of the Bureau's senior editors. She was 32 years old. They respected her. They feared her. They sent her the most difficult manuscripts, those where the line between acceptable and forbidden was thin as a razor's edge. She had moved to a better apartment by then. 1 bedroom in Georgetown, her own bathroom, a small kitchen, windows that looked out onto a quiet street lined with trees. She lived alone, had never married. There had been one man briefly in 1946, an attorney who worked for the Justice Department. They had dated for 4 months. He had proposed. She had said she needed time to think. She realized during that thinking that she couldn't imagine sharing her life with someone. Couldn't imagine explaining what she did. Couldn't imagine lying next to someone at night while the blue words floated in the darkness. She told him no. He was hurt but accepted it. She never dated again. Her entire life fit between work and insomnia because she couldn't sleep anymore. Or rather, slept little. 3 or 4 hours a night. The rest of the time she lay with open eyes staring at the ceiling and saw words, blue words, crossed out but not gone. Thousands of them by now. Lines from hundreds of manuscripts. They filled her vision like stars. Some nights she could read entire passages in the darkness, could reconstruct whole pages she had edited years ago. She went to a doctor in 1951, a psychiatrist recommended by the State Department's Health Services. She sat in his office and tried to explain. I remember everything I've edited, every word I've crossed out. I see them. At night, when I close my eyes. Sometimes during the day. They're always there. The psychiatrist made notes, asked questions about her childhood, her parents, her work stress. You're experiencing a form of occupational fatigue, he concluded. The mind, when overtaxed, can create these kinds of persistent memories. I'm prescribing barbiturates to help you sleep, and I recommend 2 weeks of rest, complete separation from work. She took the prescription, took the recommended leave, spent 2 weeks in September at a resort in the Catskills, walked through woods, sat by a lake, lay in silence. The words didn't leave. They were in the rustling of leaves. She heard lines of poetry she had crossed out. They were in the babbling of the brook. She heard dialogue from novels she had censored. They were in the silence before sleep. They whispered everything she had removed from the permanent record. When she returned to Washington, she threw away the barbiturates. They didn't help. Nothing helped. She simply learned to live with it. The constant presence of the crossed-out words. They became her companions, her ghosts, the only witnesses to what she had done. 1953 brought Eugene Mercer's manuscript to her desk. The package arrived in March, a thick manila envelope with a Montana postmark. Inside, a cover letter and 287 typed pages. Quote 27, quote, the letter began. Quote 28, quote. The novel was titled, quote, 29, quote. It was about forest rangers working in Montana wilderness. The protagonist, Samuel Ward, was a veteran ranger assigned to spend the winter season alone at a fire lookout tower deep in the mountains. The first third of the book was standard adventure fare. Samuel hiking to the remote tower, setting up his equipment, radio contact with the ranger station. The beauty and harshness of the wilderness. Then, Samuel settled into the routine of isolation, and the book changed. At first, small things. Samuel would hear his radio crackle when it was off, would see movement in the corner of his eye, would wake from dreams unable to remember if he'd been asleep or awake. Then it intensified. He began to hear voices, conversations in the static between radio channels, words that weren't quite words, messages that made no sense but felt urgent, important. He started talking to people who weren't there, would have long conversations with his dead father, with his ex-wife, with rangers who had died years ago in the mountains. But, and this was the crucial part, Samuel wasn't going mad. The novel made this clear. He was simply beginning to hear what had always been there but was drowned out by the noise of civilization, of society, of other people. The silence of the tower, absolute and crushing, had opened a door. And through that door came everything that existed in the spaces between words. The unspoken, the forbidden, the truth that language couldn't capture. Vera read the manuscript twice, then a third time. She felt cold spreading through her body, because she recognized this. She lived this. Every night when she lay in the darkness and saw the blue words, every day when she heard the whispers of everything she had crossed out. Eugene Mercer had written about her experience without knowing it. She picked up her blue pencil, and she crossed out the entire middle section of the book. 93 pages. Everything from the moment Samuel's isolation deepened to the moment before he prepared to leave the tower. She left only the beginning and the end. Samuel arrived at the tower. Samuel left the tower with his reports complete. Everything in between, the voices, the conversations with the dead, the door into the space between words, disappeared. The novel was published in October 1953, received respectful reviews. __quote _30___ wrote the reviewer in the Saturday Review. __quote _30___ Eugene Mercer came to Washington in November for a small book tour arranged by his publisher. 3 readings, 1 at a bookstore, 1 at a library, 1 at a university. Vera attended the university reading. She sat in the back row of a small lecture hall. 30 people in the audience, mostly students. Mercer was a tall man, 45 years old, with a thick beard going gray and tired eyes that seemed to look past things rather than at them. He wore a flannel shirt and work boots, looked uncomfortable in the academic setting. He read a passage from the book. The description of sunrise over the mountains. His voice was deep, measured. When he finished, he answered questions about wildlife, about Forest Service work, about writing discipline. Then a student asked, __quote _32__. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Quote 33, he finally said. Quote 34. After the reading, the room emptied quickly, students rushing to their next classes. The professor who had organized the event shaking Mercer's hand and leaving. Vera stayed in her seat. Mercer packed his books into a canvas bag. Then he looked up and saw her. Their eyes met across the empty room. He walked up the aisle toward her, stopped 3 rows away. "You're from the Bureau," he said. Not a question, a statement. She didn't answer. His voice was quiet. No anger in it, just certainty. She asked. Vera felt her hands grip the armrests of her seat. Quote 41. Quote, she said quietly. Quote 42. Quote. Quote 43. Quote. Quote 44. Quote. Quote 45. Quote. Mercer looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. Quote 46. Quote 47. Quote 48. He picked up his bag and left. Vera sat alone in the empty lecture hall. Outside, students walked past the windows, laughing, talking. Cars moved through the streets. The normal sounds of life. But underneath all of it, she heard what Mercer heard. The whispers, the voices, the words in the spaces between words. Eugene Mercer died by suicide in January 1954. He was found in his cabin outside Billings, Montana. The note he left said only, quote 49. When Vera read the obituary, she felt nothing. No surprise, no guilt, just recognition. He had heard the voices, and the voices had destroyed him, just as they would destroy her, eventually. But not yet. She still had work to do. The years blurred together. 1954, 1955, 1956, hundreds more manuscripts, hundreds more authors. The blue pencil moving steadily, confidently, striking through words, sentences, paragraphs, entire chapters. By 1956, Vera's hair had started to turn gray. She was 38 years old, but looked older. The sleepless nights had carved lines into her face. She had developed a slight tremor in her left hand. She went back to the psychiatrist. "The symptoms are worsening," she told him. "I sleep less. The memories are more vivid. I can recall entire manuscripts I edited 10 years ago, word for word, page by page." "That's impossible," he said. "Human memory doesn't work that way." "I know. But it's happening anyway. He prescribed stronger medication, suggested she consider leaving her position. This work is clearly taking a psychological toll. She didn't take the medication, didn't consider leaving. What else could she do? This was her skill, her purpose. Without it, she was nothing. In March 1956, a play manuscript arrived on her desk. Author, Calvin Whitmore, a theater director from Chicago. 42 years old, known for avant-garde productions. The play was titled Shelter. It was set entirely in a fallout shelter. 7 characters, 7 Americans from different backgrounds who had taken refuge during a nuclear attack. A doctor, a teacher, a businessman, a housewife, a teenager, a priest, a factory worker. The setup was conventional, but what happened next wasn't. Locked together for weeks with no idea if the world outside still existed, no idea if they would ever leave, the characters began to drop their masks. All pretense of civilization fell away. The doctor revealed he had become addicted to morphine, had been stealing from his own patients. The teacher confessed she had been having an affair with one of her high school students. The businessman admitted he had embezzled money from his company, ruining families. The housewife talked about the pills she took, the fantasies she had of walking into the ocean. The teenager spoke about the violence he wanted to commit, the rage he carried. The priest questioned everything he had ever believed, wondering if God had abandoned them or had never existed at all. The factory worker described in detail the accidents he had seen, the bodies he had helped remove from machines, the nightmares that never stopped. The play wasn't about survival. It was about what people become when all social pressure is removed, when there's no future, no consequences, no one watching. It was terrifying in its honesty. Vera read it 3 times. Each time she found new layers of horror. Not horror from external threats, but from the recognition of what humans truly are beneath the veneer of civilization. The play was a mirror held up to American society, and the reflection was ugly. She crossed out 2/3 of the play, left only the setup and a sanitized ending where the characters emerged from the shelter to find help had arrived, and they all expressed gratitude for their survival and renewed faith in humanity. All the confessions, all the revealed darkness, all the questioning, gone. The play was produced off-Broadway in September 1956. It ran for 2 weeks, received modest reviews. __quote _57 __, wrote the Times reviewer. __quote _58 __. Calvin Whitmore returned to Chicago. Vera thought that was the end of it. But 6 months later, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Someone had obtained a copy of the original script. Someone had given it to HUAC investigators. The questioning was brutal. Quote 59, quote 60, quote 61, quote 62, quote 63, quote 64. Blacklisted. No theater would touch him. No producer would return his calls. He went back to Chicago and took work as a janitor at a high school, drank heavily, died of cirrhosis in 1964. Vera learned this from a theater review years later that mentioned him in passing as __quote _65 __. That night, she heard new voices, the characters from Whitmore's play. They stood in the shadows of her apartment, whispering the lines she had crossed out. We thought we were civilized. But civilization is just the mask we wear when someone's watching. Down here, no one's watching. Now we can finally be honest. She turned on all the lights. The shadows didn't disappear. The voices didn't stop. She had been collecting ghosts for 13 years, and they were all speaking at once. By 1960, something fundamental had changed in her work and in the country. The Office of War Information had been dissolved years ago, its functions absorbed into various agencies. Vera had transitioned to the State Department's Cultural Affairs Division in 1948. The mission had shifted from wartime censorship to Cold War cultural management. Books sent overseas to demonstrate American values. Publications meant to showcase democracy, freedom, prosperity. Libraries established in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, stocked with carefully curated American literature. And Vera's job was still the same. Remove anything that could be misunderstood, anything that didn't present America in the proper light. She edited books about American history, crossed out detailed descriptions of slavery, softened accounts of labor conflicts, removed references to American imperialism, to the massacres of Native Americans, to the camps where Japanese Americans had been imprisoned during the war. She edited contemporary novels, removed profanity, removed sexual content, removed anything that might suggest American society had problems, inequalities, injustices. She edited poetry, crossed out despair, crossed out anger, crossed out questioning. She edited journalism, removed criticism of American foreign policy, removed accounts of poverty, removed descriptions of racial violence. The blue pencil moved faster now, more efficiently. She could process a manuscript in half the time it used to take her. She had become a machine, a mechanism, the perfect censor. She was 42 years old. Her hair was completely gray. She wore the same style of clothes she had worn for 20 years. Sensible skirts, plain blouses, sturdy shoes. She had become invisible. The perfect censor. You never noticed her until it was too late. The manuscripts kept coming, and her memory kept growing. She began keeping a private record, not official, just for herself. A small black notebook she kept locked in a desk drawer at home. She wrote down names, authors whose work had passed through her hands. She didn't write what she had done to their work. She didn't write what happened to them. She didn't need to. She remembered. The notebook filled with names. By 1965, there were more than 400. Dalton Kramer, Lenore Calloway, Eugene Mercer, Calvin Whitmore, Margaret Hendricks, poet, book pulled from publication after FBI investigation. Thomas Brenner, novelist, blacklisted after HUAC testimony. Sarah Linden, journalist, fired after article about labor conditions was censored. Robert Chang, playwright, work banned in State Department libraries overseas. On and on, page after page, names without context. But she needed no context. She remembered every detail. Sometimes, late at night, she would open the notebook, read the names slowly, remember their faces, their words, their fates. Some she knew what happened to. Many she didn't. But she could guess. In the silence of her insomnia, in the chorus of crossed-out words that filled her nights, she could guess. 1968. The country was tearing itself apart. Vietnam, riots in the streets. Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy assassinated in June. The Democratic Convention in Chicago turning into a police riot. Everything Vera had spent 25 years protecting, the image of American stability, American righteousness, American moral authority, was unraveling in real time on television. She watched from her apartment, watched the protesters, watched the police, watched the politicians struggling to explain why everything was falling apart. And she thought about all the words she had crossed out, all the warnings, all the critiques, all the expressions of doubt and despair that she had removed from the record. What if someone had been allowed to read them? Would it have made a difference? Would people have been better prepared for this moment? Or would it have happened sooner, more violently? She didn't know. Couldn't know. A manuscript arrived in August. A memoir by a young man who had refused the draft. Lawrence Brennan, 23 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania. The memoir was simple, direct. He wrote about growing up in a working-class family. His father had fought in World War II, had come home with medals and nightmares. Lawrence had grown up believing in America, in democracy, in the rightness of defending freedom. And then, he had been drafted, had been ordered to go to Vietnam, had started reading about the war, listening to the protests, talking to veterans who had returned. He described his journey from belief to doubt to refusal, not in abstract political terms, but in concrete personal terms. The moment he realized he couldn't reconcile what he believed about America with what he knew about the war. He didn't preach, didn't condemn, just described his own internal process, his own conscience, his own decision. It was the most dangerous kind of writing, because it was honest. Because it made refusal seem reasonable, even moral. Vera crossed out half the memoir, changed the arc completely, made his doubt temporary, superficial, made his refusal into a confusion born from listening to the wrong people, made the resolution come when he realized his duty and reconsidered his decision. The book was published in November 1968, sold poorly, a few dozen copies maybe. Lawrence Brennan did one reading at a bookstore in Philadelphia. 15 people attended. Then he disappeared from public view. Vera learned years later that he had fled to Canada, never returned, was still living in Toronto, working as a teacher. She wondered if he had ever read the published version of his memoir, if he had recognized himself in the sanitized words, if he understood what had been done to his truth. She suspected he had, and suspected he never wrote again. The knock came on a Thursday afternoon in June 1973. Vera was 55 years old, still working, though they had offered her early retirement. She had declined. What would she do without the work? Who would she be? Two men in dark suits stood at her apartment door. They showed her FBI badges. "Miss Ashford, we need to ask you some questions about your work." Her blood turned cold, but her face remained calm. 30 years of discipline. "What kind of questions?" "May we come in?" She let them in. They sat in her living room. One of them pulled out a notebook. The other did the talking. "We're conducting a review of certain State Department editorial practices. Specifically, we're investigating whether there's been any pattern of suppression that might constitute a violation of civil liberties." "I don't understand." "We have testimony from several authors whose work was substantially altered during the editorial process. They claim the changes went beyond normal editing, that entire meanings were reversed, that their books became unrecognizable. I make editorial recommendations based on department guidelines. We'd like to ask you about specific cases." They went through names. She recognized some. Others were unfamiliar. They might have been edited by her colleagues. "Do you remember editing a manuscript by Eugene Mercer in 1953? A novel about a forest ranger?" "I edit many manuscripts. I don't recall specific titles from 20 years ago." The FBI agent looked at her steadily. "We have a copy of the original manuscript, and the published version. 93 pages were removed, entire plot threads deleted. The book fundamentally changed. Do you remember that?" "If I edited it, I would have followed departmental guidelines." "Do you know what happened to Mr. Mercer?" "No." "He died by suicide in 1954. Did you know that?" "I don't track what happens to authors after publication. That's not my job." "No?" The other agent pulled out something from his briefcase, her black notebook. Vera felt her heart stop. "This was found in your apartment during a search conducted under warrant this morning while you were at work. It's a list of names, authors you've worked with. Some of them have years next to them. Years of death. Were you tracking them, Miss Ashford?" "That's private property. We have a warrant, and we're investigating whether you've been conducting unauthorized surveillance of American citizens, whether you've been maintaining files beyond your official duties." She said nothing. Her mind raced. How had they known about the notebook? Who had informed them? "I keep notes from my own records, to track authors I've worked with. There's nothing illegal about that." Some of these authors faced serious consequences: blacklisting, loss of employment, investigation, in some cases death. And you were tracking them. Why? I wasn't tracking them. I was simply noting names of authors whose work I edited. Mr. Mercer, Miss Calloway, Mr. Whitmore, Mr. Brennan. All of them had their work substantially altered by you. All of them suffered consequences. Did you know that would happen? Of course she knew. She had always known. I was following departmental guidelines. I was doing my job. Were you? Or were you making judgment calls that went far beyond your authority? Were you using your position to destroy authors whose views you disagreed with? That's absurd. Is it? Because looking at this pattern, Miss Ashford, it seems you've been operating as your own one-woman censorship board for 30 years, making decisions about what Americans can and cannot read. And when the original versions of these works surfaced, when people read what you had crossed out, the authors faced consequences. Did you anticipate that? Did you want that? I wanted to protect the national interest. Whose definition of the national interest? The question hung in the air. They left with her notebook, told her not to leave the city. She might be called for further questioning. She sat alone in her apartment. For the first time in 30 years, she felt truly afraid. Not of the FBI, not of the investigation, not even of possible prosecution, but of the silence that followed. Because without the notebook, without the names written down in her own hand, she only had her memory. And her memory was perfect. Too perfect. Inescapable. Every name, every manuscript, every crossed-out word, all of it inside her head. Forever. The investigation was quietly closed 6 months later. No charges filed. No explanation given. The notebook was not returned. Vera suspected someone higher up had intervened. The investigation had gotten too close to revealing things the State Department didn't want revealed. Better to bury it quietly. She retired in February 1974. They gave her a small ceremony. 20 people attended. They presented her with a plaque thanking her for 31 years of dedicated service. Made brief speeches about her professionalism, her attention to detail, her dedication. No one mentioned what she had actually done. No one said the word censorship. She took the plaque home, put it in a closet, never looked at it again. Retirement was impossible. For 30 years, her life had been manuscripts, blue pencils, words crossed out, structure, purpose, a clear understanding of what she was supposed to do. Now, nothing. She woke each morning with nowhere to go, no manuscripts waiting, no deadlines, no job. The silence was unbearable. And in that silence, the voices grew louder. All the crossed-out words, all the deleted passages, all the suppressed truths. They filled her apartment, whispered from every corner, echoed in the pipes, breathed in the radiator's hiss. At night, they were overwhelming. She would lie in bed and see entire manuscripts scrolling past her vision, every word glowing blue, every sentence she had ever struck through. Thousands of pages, hundreds of authors, 30 years of deletions, all of it inside her head, demanding to be remembered, refusing to be forgotten. She stopped sleeping almost entirely, would sit in her chair by the window, watching the city, listening to the voices. Sometimes she would talk back to them, would explain why she had crossed them out, would justify each decision. Other times she would just listen, let them speak, let them accuse her. Because they were right. She knew they were right. She had been the instrument of their silence, and now they were the instrument of hers. When the young people from Beacon Press came in November 1975, she understood immediately what she had to do. Write it all down. Every word, every author, every crossed-out line, everything she remembered. Give the voices physical form. Let them speak through her, one final time. The truth. But as she began writing, she realized something. The truth wasn't just what she had done to others. It was what had been done to her. Because somewhere along the way, she couldn't pinpoint exactly when, she had stopped being Vera Ashford, stopped being a person with her own thoughts, her own beliefs, her own voice. She had become an instrument, a mechanism, the blue pencil given human form. Every manuscript that passed through her hands had taken something from her. Every deletion had erased a piece of her own self. Every crossed-out word had carved away at her own identity until there was nothing left but the job, the function, the role. And now, in retirement, without the job, she was discovering that there was nothing underneath. No core self, no Vera separate from the censor. She was hollow, a shell, filled only with other people's words, the words she had destroyed. She wrote for a week, every day, morning to night, sometimes through the night. The words flowed, the stories poured out. Names, faces, fates. She wrote about Dalton Kramer, the factory worker whose honest book became propaganda, who couldn't live with what his words had become. She wrote about Lenore Calloway, whose poems about silence got her investigated, blacklisted, erased. She wrote about Eugene Mercer, who heard voices in the wilderness, whose truths were deleted, who died because the silence became too loud. She wrote about Calvin Whitmore, whose play revealed uncomfortable truths about civilization, who was destroyed for showing what lay beneath the mask. She wrote about Lawrence Brennan, whose honest memoir of conscience was twisted into propaganda, who fled rather than live the lie. She wrote about hundreds of others. The poets whose despair was replaced with optimism, the novelists whose social criticism was removed, the journalists whose investigations were suppressed, the playwrights whose questions were answered for them. She wrote about the machinery of censorship, the guidelines, the review processes, the quiet pressure, the understanding that some truths were too dangerous to allow. And she wrote about herself, about the young woman who had taken the job believing she was protecting something important, about the years of slow transformation, about the moment, if there had been a moment, when she had crossed a line from editor to destroyer, about the perfect memory that was both gift and curse, about the voices that never stopped, about the realization that she had become a ghost haunting her own life. 300 pages, 60,000 words. The complete record, the hidden history, the truth that had been crossed out and suppressed for 30 years. She finished on the last day of November, reread the entire manuscript, checked every fact she could check, every date, every name. It was all there, everything she remembered. She called Beacon Press. "It's finished." They came the next morning, the same two young people, still enthusiastic, still certain that truth mattered. "Miss Ashford, this is going to change everything," the woman said, flipping through the pages. "People need to know this. They need to understand what was done in the name of national security." Vera said nothing, just watched them pack the manuscript into their canvas bag. "We'll be in touch about edits," the man said. "Should be ready to publish by spring." After they left, Vera sat by her window, looked out at the city, at people hurrying through the November cold, at cars moving through the streets, at the normal flow of life. And she thought, maybe now I can forget. Maybe now that it's written down, recorded, preserved, maybe the voices will finally stop. Maybe I can finally sleep. But the book never came out. In January 1976, Beacon Press called. 1 month passed. 2. 3. The calls from Beacon became less frequent, more apologetic, more vague. In April, Vera called them. Long pause. Quote, 106, quote. Quote, 107, quote. Quote, 108, quote. Quote, 109, quote. She hung up, sat by her window, watched the city. Spring 1976, America's bicentennial year. The country celebrating 200 years of freedom, of democracy, of liberty. And her book, The only book she had ever written herself, the complete record of 30 years of suppressing truth, remained unpublished, crossed out, like everything else. The voices came back that night, louder than ever. All the authors, all the words, all the deleted passages. They filled her apartment like a crowd. She sat in her chair and listened to them. Let them speak. Let them accuse. Because she deserved it. She had thought that writing it down would free her, that telling the truth would somehow redeem 30 years of suppressing truth. But redemption wasn't possible. Some things couldn't be undone. Some silences couldn't be broken. The manuscript was gone, lost in a bankruptcy liquidation, probably destroyed, probably never to be seen again. Just like all the words she had crossed out, everything returned to silence in the end. Vera lived another 15 years. Quiet years. Invisible years. She rarely left her apartment, had her groceries delivered, had no friends, no family except a distant nephew who called once a year at Christmas. The voices never stopped, but she learned to live with them. They became background noise, the constant hum of her existence. Sometimes young people would come to her door, journalists, researchers, people who had heard rumors about her work, about what she had done. She never let them in, never spoke to them, just closed the door. What was the point? The truth didn't matter. It had never mattered. It had been crossed out, suppressed, destroyed, just like everything else. She died on March 12, 1991, 73 years old, alone in her apartment, quietly in her sleep. The nephew came to clear out the apartment, hired a service to remove the furniture, dispose of the belongings. They found boxes and boxes of papers, old manuscripts, notes, letters. The workers didn't bother reading them, just loaded everything into a truck and took it to a disposal facility. 300 pages of memoir, the manuscript that had been returned from the bankruptcy liquidation years ago, that Vera had never bothered to retrieve, were incinerated along with hundreds of other documents. The ashes were swept away, the record destroyed, the silence complete. But memory doesn't die that easily. Somewhere in the vast archives of the State Department, in boxes that haven't been opened in decades, original manuscripts still exist. The versions before Vera's blue pencil, the words that were crossed out but not destroyed. Someday, perhaps, someone will find them. We'll compare them to the published versions. We'll reconstruct the deletions. We'll piece together the truth. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the crossed-out words will remain in darkness forever. In that space between what was written and what was allowed to be read, in the library of the suppressed, the archive of silence, where Vera Ashford still sits, in her own peculiar afterlife, surrounded by all the words she tried to erase, reading them, remembering them, forever. Because that was her punishment. Not legal punishment, not earthly punishment, but the punishment of perfect memory, of being unable to forget, of carrying every suppressed truth inside her consciousness for all eternity. The keeper of crossed-out words, the guardian of silence, the ghost who remembers everything that was meant to be forgotten. Among her papers, eventually found by an archivist in 2003 during a routine State Department records review, was a single page, not part of any official manuscript, just a note, handwritten, dated November 1975. It read, "I crossed out their words because I was told it would protect something precious. Democracy, freedom, safety, national security. But what I really crossed out was truth. And truth, once silenced, doesn't disappear. It waits. In the spaces between words, in the silence we pretend is peace, in the memories of those who tried to speak it. It waits for someone to speak it again. I couldn't be that person. I was the eraser, not the writer, the censor, not the truth-teller. I spent 30 years creating silence, and now the silence has consumed me. But I hope, I desperately hope, that someday someone will find these words, the real words, not the sanitized versions, not the propaganda, the truth that I crossed out and tried to bury. Because the crossed out words are the ones that matter most. They're the ones someone feared, and what is feared is usually what is true. I am 57 years old. I have lived most of my life in service to silence. But silence is not peace. It is not protection. It is not safety. Silence is simply another word for fear. And I have been afraid my entire life. Afraid of what would happen if people knew the truth. Afraid of what would happen if uncomfortable words were spoken. Afraid of disorder, of chaos, of the collapse of the carefully maintained image. But the image was always a lie, and I was its keeper. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I only ask that someone, someday, remember what I helped destroy. Remember the words I crossed out. Remember the voices I silenced. Remember that silence is never neutral. It is always a choice. And I made that choice every day for 30 years. This is my confession, my testimony, my final act of truth-telling. I remember everything, and I cannot forget, and I do not want to forget, because someone must remember what was lost, even if that someone is only me, even if no one else ever knows. I remember. I will always remember. Vera Ashford. The note was filed away in the archives, classified, then declassified, then refiled, forgotten again, but not lost, because nothing is ever truly lost. It just waits, in the spaces between, where all the crossed-out words live forever, where Vera Ashford still sits, reading, remembering, keeping watch over the library of silence, forever.